So why don't you just start with who you are, what your experience is in the industry, and how you discovered Prism, and then like how it's evolved over the time that you've been using it.
Sure. Well, my name's Matt Berenger. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Pabst Theater Group in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Uh, we operate 6 different venues here in Milwaukee, ranging on the small side from 450 cap club to a 4,000 seat theater. And I've been doing this for 20 years out here in Milwaukee, 20 plus years. And, you know, big part of my role, obviously, in addition to booking shows and promoting events and that kind of stuff, is also, uh, running the broader operations, business operations here at the Pabst. And so, um, you know, as it relates to something like Prism, the tool is really invaluable to us because we made a decision fairly early on, that we needed really during the pandemic, made a decision that, the old way of chugging along and just doing stuff wasn't going to work for us anymore. We had multiple departments that were constantly saying, well, you know, we're not communicating. We don't, you know, see the same thing all the time. There's a lot of mistakes or there's stuff that gets, left out kind of in the dark. And we actually originally started trying to design our own software. And somewhere in the midst of that, one of our more astute employees who had bumped into Prism, I think at a conference, said, "Hey, you ought to look at Prism." And we looked at it and we said, "Well, you know what? This is it." Right? Because what we really needed was it wasn't just how do we manage our calendar, it wasn't just how do we build offers. It was I need um, you know, I need a full 360-degree solution so that, the person that's booking the show, the person in the box office, the production manager, marketing, everybody is kind of seeing, you know, the same thing in real time. We talk about like getting to that one source of truth, I think was that the Salesforce thing or whatever, single source of truth, something like that. But, for us, it was a real need. And so, because that was the number one conversation was just everybody is disjointed. Everybody's, isn't getting communication. Things are getting missed, one thing or another. And so we looked at Prism and we said, okay, if this is going to work for us, the big key is kind of universal buy-in from the staff too. And I think that piece of it was really critical in terms of our implementation, because what it meant was, this is no longer an optional thing for the staff. We looked at the solution. We said, this is at the time, good enough for what we need. In my brain, certainly on the calendar side of things and, the offer writing side of things and settlement side of things, it definitely exceeded the other programs that we've seen. Um, in the now 6 years that we've been on Prism, I think it's 6 years. Got to be, right? 25. Sorry, 5 years. So in the 5 years we've been on Prism, um, one of the impressive things has just been the level of improvement through the course of it. And even at that time, though, it was like, okay, the big piece of it for us was we went through every single department and we said, what's the application? How is this used? What does the handoff look like? And it's been great. So yeah, we're very, very happy with it, and very happy with how our staff is able to use this really to just be more on the same page.
Great, great. Over the years, what are some of the key things that we've launched that have been helpful for you?
Well, I mean, for sure, just consistent improvement in things like the offer writing, the settlement, and that sort of thing. When we started, we launched, we came onto Prism at the same time that we switched ticketing companies. And so we were sitting inside of this world where we'd never seen things like we're on Access, so we have Access Premium. Ticketmaster Platinum would be the equivalent of that. And that was something that we hadn't really contemplated. How do we um, work that into our system of settlement and that kind of thing? And Prism at the time had some ways to do it, but admittedly, this was especially in the independent venue space was still developing, and people were still catching on to platinum and premium and that kind of thing in the independent venue space. AEG and Live Nation had been doing it for years, but in that case, uh, we started saying, okay, we'll use a workaround, which worked just fine within the program, but we brought it to Prism and said, hey, look at this. This is going to be important, and this is going to be important to more clients. And even though there's a workaround, it's critical that these settlements are clean. It's critical that these settlements are easy to understand, and that the box office is able to enter this in a way that makes sense. And the funny thing about it was Prism didn't just come up with a single solution. They had two different ways to solve it that rolled out within the course of that. But between that, um, I know that a CoPro was a massive project, and I always knew that a CoPro was a fairly complicated transaction until we started like kind of diving in with Prism, who kind of asked for our feedback. I never really imagined just how complicated it could be. It's sort of like one of those things where
Yeah.
you knock a hole in the drywall, and all of a sudden you see that there's all this plumbing that you didn't expect
Oh,
underneath it,
yeah. Well put, by
and
the way. Well
and
put.
and I think that one, I really commend the team for following through on that. And then there's always just little, improvements. I noticed, last week, it's like, okay, we've got these, you know, uh, different values now for variable expenses, something that
Yeah.
had been sitting out there forever. And then just one day it's sort of live. And it's not like other,
Are you using now that now the internal and external?
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. As soon as I saw it, I went and updated our templates right away.
Awesome.
Went and updated our templates
That's
right away.
yeah.
Yeah. But even that, I mean, the run of show has gone from something, and those were like, little areas. It was like, okay, we can live with it. But within Prism, I could tell that there was just this real commitment to constantly developing, constantly making the program better. And you guys have been pretty good about telling us no when it's a no, which is not something you get. My experience with um, a lot of other software companies has been uh, they're willing to tell you anything is possible and then just hope that you don't notice when it kind of gets pushed down and down and down. Prism has been pretty straightforward with us. But it's very tempting to come in with a huge laundry list of things that Prism should be able to do because it's so expansive in what it does in the first place.
Yeah.
Um, y-
Yeah.
you know, and so I think that those goals over the years have been that just chipping away at addressing every little need and not just focusing, y- you know, not just focusing. I'm guessing for Prism, the tip of the spear kind of client is generally the talent buyer or generally the booker. And I think over the years, Prism has done a good job of making itself a really well-rounded program to fit into kind of some of the things that we're talking about with the broader staff using it, the broader team using it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to circle back on CoPro because that just was such a
Hmm.
big project, and we did talk about it early on, and it ended up being a bit of an odyssey of a
Yeah.
project. And I think to your point, a lot of it was due to punching a hole in the drywall and then realizing, oh, there's that room's a mess, but then you punch the hole in the next three rooms, and it like expands even further. But
Yeah.
I'm glad where it all landed, and if you could kind of speak to like where the solution is currently at,
Well, yeah,
I
it's
could hear.
now it's the way that it should be. Absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, now it's the way that it should be. But again, there was because when we started with CoPro on our side, the first version of it was we're saying, okay, we literally are just settling every show twice because I have to go into Prism. I'm going to do the normal settlement, the artist settlement, and then I'm going to transcribe everything over onto my spreadsheet. and, you know, work enough cells back and forth and hope that everything adds up. And it's good to have that um, that system base to be a backup to go, okay, is, to have a cross reference, but in some cases it led to a lot of work. Um, you know, there was that middle gap solution, which involved Prism saying, hey, we realize this isn't perfect, but we're going to spit out the information that you need so that you can at least get this settled without a ton of work. And we're at least working off of, system generated numbers. And our staff got pretty good at settling on that kind of
The interim solution. Yeah.
interim solution.
Yeah.
And I would say with that interim solution, it was something where I didn't, after a while, I didn't necessarily think of it as, okay, we're desperate for the next thing, because it was positive enough. But I give you guys credit for identifying, hey, this is a day-to-day need for the promoters. And as much as you'd like to roll out something that was perfect and beautiful right this minute, um, there's kind of a pressing need. And so we, ran with that for, y- you know, a good long time. And I think it worked quite well for us. But the new solution, um, you do it now and you almost feel like you're doing something wrong because it's so smooth. It works the way that it should. And I looked at,
You're not used to it being so easy, huh?
yeah, you feel like, okay, I'm going to set aside and, 30 minutes to get this done. And it's like, no, CoPro knocks out in 5 minutes.
Wow.
I mean,
Awesome.
it
Yeah.
really does. It really does go that fast for us. And a lot of it is very intuitive. And, that stuff is really important when you're in our business, in terms of the kind of volume that we do, because I can book shows all day long. Um, what I can't do on my side is, I personally, if our company books 700 shows a year. So there's physically no way for me to be at 700 shows a year.
Yeah.
Um, and getting something complex like a CoPro where I can go, okay, this is easy to understand for maybe a junior employee to come in and do the settlement and not have it left open to a lot of error, is really freeing to the company, because um, you're trusting people with the ability to come in and do, higher level work and do things that are, we're traditionally like, okay, we're going to drag, Behringer out of bed at, 1 in the morning or whatever to come do this. Now we can say, okay, we have a much more efficient kind of, you talk about that baton handoff. I can have the production manager roll in and do it. I can have, the booking assistant roll in and do it. And it's easy to understand. It's intuitive. It's not laborious. And in the first place, like, I think even talking about like employee education, we're still teaching the concept. We're still there, working through it. It just means you don't have to be an Excel spreadsheet expert to execute the transaction,
Yeah.
or you're not left open to the amount of nights that have been cut down where I'm sitting with a promoter rep who's got, somebody's got a error in the cell of their sheet somewhere, and we're off being, forensic accountants trying to figure it out. Those have cut way, way back. The
Yes.
amount of late night calls of, we can't get this to balance or this or the other thing, because Prism balances really quickly. It's way easier to do. And honestly, it shouldn't be hard. What we're doing is a lot of replication of tasks. And, you know, I think especially in CoPro, the final product here has been really good.
Awesome. Awesome. I love that. I'll just make sure I was not on mute. Um, something, who knows if I'll end up using this or not, but
Yeah.
something that you're getting at, I think, Prism's been a 7-year push, or I'm like, I'm losing track of time. Are we going on seven? I guess like, you came in about 2 years on, and now it's 2025. So
Yeah.
They were in our seventh season, and we've had there was a couple systems, early on that ticketing companies had pumped out, and home bake systems, and some stuff that has popped up along the way. And I think, I think about where Prism was in 2008, and kind of where it is now. And on the surface, to your point, like it shouldn't be so hard. But I think you have been a great testament to like why, like, a very primitive version of Prism just like doesn't, doesn't cut it, and like why we've had to kind of constantly, you know, added more and more and more around like pre-settlement fees and the dynamic ticketing and the
Oh yeah.
and like what's your perspective on like the complexity of like, what Prism does, and like why something so simple does end up turning into a complex thing, and like how Prism has like uniquely been able to step into that.
Well, I think it's funny you talk about it being, you know, ticketing systems taking a stab at it, that concept, and that makes actually a lot of sense, honestly, because the big piece of it, my concept with the product that we sell is that, on its face, it looks really simple, right?
Yeah.
Ticket, you get in, and maybe a general admission ticket is relatively simple. But when you get into the weeds, especially when you talk about the majority of our business, which is reserve seat ticketing, we're talking about an incredibly complex product, because the fact is that this is basically a 100% custom product for the consumer. That seat in that spot for that show, you
Yeah.
know, with that whatever, it's like on and on and on. And um, you know, everything sort of flows from there as far as those levels of complexity, because there's only one of it. And so now we're cataloging all of these different things. Um, Starting obviously with the ticketing, but then all the different aspects of how is this deal cut or how is that deal cut. And like I said, on its surface, it looks really simple, but we get into like you talked about. I mean, dynamic ticketing is a perfect example. It's like, okay, can we do multiple, ticket scales at a different price? Sure. Okay, can we take some tickets that are in one ticket scale and push them into another? Sure. Okay, can we take just a flat number and add it to the gross? Well, is there a ticket attached to it? Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like, so the programmer is like, my head just exploded,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's like, that, that same kind of concept applies to all of these little weird idiosyncrasies to our business.
Yeah.
There is a version of the settlement that is for the artist. There's a version of the settlement that understands, what is it internally as a true venue cost. There's another version of the settlement that goes, okay, we've got a partner involved here now, and what should that look like?
Yep.
And every single time we try to handshake and try to build something in, we go, okay, there are little complexities, little idiosyncrasies to each of these. Is it percentage based? Is it per ticket based? Is it attendee based? All those things add up to additional complexities. And, um, y- you know, I think the impulse is to look at it and go, well, it's just an Excel spreadsheet, right? But I always describe something like Prism, in a good way, as being a very rigid environment, right? And, I dealt with this with a tour accountant a couple of weeks ago where it was like, they're saying, well, can we just round this up or just round that out? And it's like, no, we're getting to the bottom of the truth here.
Yeah.
Um, things you can't things you could do on a spreadsheet, but ultimately the benefit here is that you're not leaving yourself open to error. You're not leaving yourself open to what's the next mistake, what's the next mistake, and these kinds of things waterfalling. So that kind of living in that rigid environment, um, on the one hand, it means, okay, if I want to be, pushing in one direction or another as far as some of these things that just pop up, I have to think a little bit more hard about how I'm going to address it. But what it does at the end of the day is it forces you to reduce the number of errors, forces you to, you know, push into, you know, the most accurate possible financial settlement. Does that all make sense?
I mean, thank you. You're spelling it out really, really, really well. And there's just thousands of tedious little details.
Yeah.
We've had to build into the product, and you're one of the companies that use it. And I think the higher volume that you do, and the more complex you get into the venues, and the more complex of the setup that you're doing with ticketing, and the more team members you want accessing the system to do specific things, and then it all somehow flows perfectly for the right people at the right time.
Right.
That's kind of what, like, put simply, if you were like, would you want to cheap out on like, would you want to drive with this problem that you have, put ticketing aside, what's your gut reaction to say, like, would you want to use the very built out robust system, or would you feel that it could be solved with something that wasn't as built out as Prism? Yeah.
Well, of course, I mean, that's the old penny wise, pound foolish conversation,
Yeah.
and I think that, if you're and I run into this with, promoters and venues all the time where you say, okay, you kind of have to ask yourself, um, you know, what kind of a business are you?
Yep.
Are you just, you know, scrappy and talented and just like everything else can kind of live in Squishyville? That's cool. Or are you a mature analytical business? And I think, especially in our industry, there's a little bit of an impulse to, move away from that kind of analytical side of things in some cases, because it feels like, okay, we're doing rock and roll here. And I see it with in the old days with our bar, it was this way where it was like, um, you come out and you do these very high profile, exciting things, and you almost forget, like, oh no, there's like, y- you know the best thing you can do at the end of the day is analyze your data. That's really the best thing you can do at the end of the day. It's like putting on the show is incredibly important. Getting out there and having a quality experience for your fan, having a quality experience for, your artist. Those are all, um, you know tent poles to what we do. But if we weren't analyzing it at the end of the day, um, it's all, you're putting the sustainability of that in real jeopardy. And, you look at Prism. I mean, to me, one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle is the reporting, for us. And so, I'm doing, in addition to where we come up with our, monthly P&L and all that kind of stuff is, devised by our accounting department. We're looking at it going, okay, what's the other data we can pull out of this? Number one, how does it match to the information we're seeing systematically generated through our accounting system? How does it feed into that? What are we doing to save time? What are we doing to save mistakes? And, with the volume of business that we're doing, I hate to think, going back 10 years, how many mistakes did we make, from a financial standpoint, that were just done because it's sitting on a spreadsheet on somebody's computer that wasn't accessible in that moment, or it was something that was recorded by somebody and just got lost in the shuffle. When you look at the reporting, I mean, I'm able to dive in now and go, okay, who are my top agents? What are my top genres? What are the top agencies? What are the top promoters that we work with? And so, from a strategy standpoint for us, that tells us directionally where we're going to go in ways that were way harder to access, pre Prism, where we would be saying, okay, like, we have kind of these gut feelings about things, and, gathering that data because it's all dispersed in other places, or it's sitting, local to somebody's hard drive or another, would be incredibly difficult to do. Now I can look at, um, data, and I can make forecasting decisions that, frankly, are every single day making the company more sustainable.
I love that. That's again, it's a great kind of it's words to a concept that I had, in my head, and this has been a very, very interesting conversation. Well,
Yeah.
let me ask you about this part of it. So, I think it was maybe some time around maybe close to 8 months ago. I started telling you about this idea to create a data share, an opt-in data share and we called it Insights. And you were one of the very early ones on. So,
Yeah.
would be really curious to hear your perspective about what did you think when I first brought the idea to you? You saw us launched it, hopped on. We've grown the database quite a bit since then. So, give me the whole arc of your experience with Insights. Yeah, from me first telling you the idea and why you were intrigued by it.
Well, I mean, obviously intrigued by it because it is, um, 100% true that at least from a sheer data standpoint, not just locally within our account, but globally within Prism, that there is some incredibly powerful stuff there. And on its face, it feels, audacious, right? To go, okay, how do we start to coalesce some of this stuff? And you almost go like, well, is this, you know, y- what are the rules of the game here and how should this all work? And I remember the phone call where you kind of asked me that question. But one of the things that I think is really important to look at from a the standpoint of an independent promoter, independent business is, we're not playing on a level playing field. If you have these large corporate conglomerates, and not in a bad way or whatever, the power of these, frankly, is that they have access to tons and tons and tons of data. And it's not just like, okay, they're kind of feeling their way out and going like, how does this work? How does that work? They go, okay, I have a question that has a concrete answer, and they can go over to the supercomputer, network database and say, I'm going to get much better answers than Matt Berenger, who's kind of sitting there solo in Milwaukee, putting his finger in the air and trying to figure out which way the wind is blowing. And uh, a tool like Insight, you know, is something that it doesn't totally level set it, but it goes a long way to saying, okay, we're going to now have the ability to answer some of those questions that for an independent promoter, um, would have otherwise been sort of out in the ether, you know, and we understand that the data that's there, uh, has high integrity, and we understand that it it resides. I think you guys have done a very good job of finding the equilibrium between, um, retaining everybody's independence, retaining everybody's sort of autonomy, but also offering that resource that an independent would never have access to, that oftentimes their competition, if the other folks in the market, not even competition, but just their peers, um, have these tools that they would never be able to see. So I think that's a real positive.
Yeah,
Um,
that's an amazing point. If you have a Live Nation venue in town,
mhm.
you're like fighting with very different tools. They're playing drone warfare, and you got like a whatever. I don't know. Sorry to use a war analogy, but like they have access to that Live Nation kind of like data set. And you're just again what promoters were telling.
Well, and
Oh, go
even
ahead.
in cases where
Yeah,
we're not competing with Live Nation,
yeah,
if
yeah.
if an event comes across my desk and I look at it and I go like, I mean, so like a good example of that would be this show, and these guys are going to be at Neva. They're great. There's this group that is out working on this thing called Bingo Loco. Have you heard of
Okay.
that?
No.
We have it this Saturday.
Yeah.
It's it's kind of billed as the craziest, most fun game of bingo you'll ever play. And they bring in a big
Oh.
LED screen and crank music and throw a huge party. And, they're doing a crazy big bingo thing. And, all of the assets that they have look pretty, it looks like fun. They're saying that they're selling out shows, but at some level, I'm just taking their word for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so that's the life of an independent promoter. I don't have somebody that I can necessarily get on the phone or look into the supercomputer and go, oh, what's Bingo Loco doing? I'm pretty much out on an island. Right. And now we can look at it and we go, okay, both, you know, it presumably will report this event that truly blew up. I mean, I can tell you that if that were the case, um, within a larger corporate conglomerate, the first thing that happens is a company memo goes out that says, "Hey, if you've got open Saturday nights in your clubs that are between, y you know, 500 to 1,000, please get Bingo Loco in there right away." You
Yeah.
know? Now what's gonna happen is anybody that's savvy and is able to look at insights and go, "Okay, what's going on in Milwaukee?" And they may not get the full picture, but they're getting enough to go, "I need to pay attention to this because the data that's reported has a high level of integrity, and I understand Milwaukee not necessarily to be in New York or LA or Chicago, and so I need to pay attention to this because if I'm sitting in Cleveland or if I'm sitting in Detroit or Minneapolis or whatever, these markets and aren't necessarily, I mean, aren't necessarily like stuff just works. Now we found something, right? And, um, you know, where you're otherwise kind of clueless, you can get into that, you get a better understanding of those sorts of things.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So are you finding how much is your team in insights and how has it become a part of your process? Would you say, the majority of your shows you're getting information from insights or
Yeah. Look, we look for every event. If we're doing an offer, that's part of it's instantly part of the conversation for every single one. We have obviously other research that we do and other things that we look at, but it's a critical piece of the puzzle. In many cases, it's we still do like Polestar tour history reports and that kind of stuff. But again, when I look at the data on insights, I see it generally as more reliable, um,
awesome.
because
Awesome.
it's system generated and it's not self-reported.
Yep. Yep. Interesting. Have you some of the stories that I've heard from other promoters is, they can pinpoint an event when I talked to them recently that either they passed on or they made a more sensible offer and they were able
Mhm.
to more confidently call the bluff. 10,000 offer went 20,000 offer went down to $10,000 offer and like bam right there. There's like a chunk of their Prism subscription they can justify with like one show. Like have you had experiences with that and would you say it's consistent or like what is the net thing that actually happens from like having more data when you're like, deciding whether or not you're going to make these bets? Yeah.
Well, it's all day long. I mean, certainly when it comes to insights, yeah, I mean, we can, again, it's becoming increasingly scarce as far as things like Pulsar reporting. There was always a question as to whether that data was consistent because of just the natural impulse to say, if I had a bad date, I'm not going to report it, you know?
Yeah, there's perverse
And
incentives all over the place for self-reporting. The agent wants to report the stuff that works. The promoter, wants to get on the list. No one wants to report the bad stuff because it's like,
right,
you know, for better or worse, 30 years ago, Polestar, my understanding is no one wanted to report to Polestar at first, and so they started publishing the list. They became a publication, but
right.
then I think the publication kind of took precedence over the reporting itself, and then it's like, okay, if that's how you got people to report, and immediately, I mean, I won't name names, but I've had people tell me that on the agency side that they have been told to add zeros to their Polestar reporting, and I was like, wow, you just committed fraud, like, right there, and you just told me you committed fraud. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
it's pretty wild.
Yeah. In our place, we don't get too excited about the lists or anything like that. But certainly,
Yeah,
from the standpoint of understanding that those areas, at least at one time, were widely surfed by people within the industry, I think was an important piece of the puzzle. But as it relates again to insights, yeah, you're seeing a much fuller picture and specific to independent venues, you know,
Yeah.
specific to places that are like you. And
And
so,
but there's
absolutely, that
yeah. Yeah.
data is important. That data is important in decision making, and 100%. I can't, um, I can't make a guess on how many car crashes I've stopped by, having the headlights on, but I'm gonna guess it's probably quite a few.
Cool. Cool. It's right. It's added up. I love to hear that. We like preventing car crashes for sure. Uh, and that was my core assumption was that the first thing that it would do is would just kind of help put square pegs in square holes, round pegs and round holes in terms of like, deciding, oh hey, you know what? Like, maybe this artist shouldn't play the Pabst Theater. They should go and play the Altera or whatever.
Oh,
And
yeah, yeah.
but I also had hope that over time, and maybe this happens much later in the game over time, that there's a discovery element to it that you're able to kind of say, oh, you know what? I didn't realize this band was out playing shows or, part of the advantage of Pulsar is you get the magazine and then you're just kind of, it's a way to kind of stay in the loop, like who's touring, who's doing well. But if
Yeah.
you're finding your team is kind of going in there and looking at the leaderboard and looking at like, the bands that are grossing in Prism over the last month, or if you're trying to do another thing that I thought people would use the leaderboard for is, look at the top. If you're booking a specific type of festival, let's say you're booking a hip hop festival, you can go in there and say like, show me all the hip hop genres, top grossing bands that have played the Midwest in the last 12 months. Have you gone
Mhm.
to any of these kind of discovery use cases? Anyone stand out, or is it more so just kind of like, sense checking, your or yeah, making sense of like whether or not an offer makes sense for an artist? Yeah, which yeah,
No, I mean, we do a regular sweep. I do a weekly sweep of, I think that's part of the process for us anyway, from the booking standpoint is, um, I'm not necessarily like waking up in the morning and going, okay, I've got to find a hip hop band because we,
yeah,
you know, have too much or don't have enough for one thing or another. But, when I go through that, I make a practice of going through the insights charts and, you know, you know, my routine is sitting down and making a list of everything that's surprising to me, right? And so, there's lots of things that we understand at face value. Is Chapel Roan going to sell a boatload of tickets? Of course she is,
yeah, yeah,
but to go back to like, the bingo loco
yeah,
conversation, it's like, who would have guessed? We just put this show on sale today called Basement Yard, right? Podcast, really popular podcast. I think that when that hits Insight, that'd be the first part where I go, okay, that's surprising. I did not expect that. And those are the kinds of things that we're looking because, especially again, as an independent promoter, your, your job is to be 2 weeks earlier than everybody else is. That's how you get good at what you do. And something like insights, we go, okay, like that's the piece of it. What are the surprising results? So that's really what we're looking for when we go through it. But I definitely am using the tools, using the charts, and going, okay, what can I see? What can I see? And in our case, we're booking a range of venue sizes too. And so the ability to push and pull into, okay, this week I'm trying to fill Friday nights at Vibarium, or I'm trying to fill, trying to make sure that we're rounding out things in the 4,000 seats. I can look at it and go, okay, what's the broader year? What are the things that I missed? Not just over the course of the last week or the course of the last, month. What does 12 months look like on artists selling 3,000 plus seats? And that's a much different exercise than, I'm trying to fill dates and trying to make sure that we're, populating our smaller rooms. Does that
I
make
love
sense? Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, great. I'm glad to hear. that you're using that.
Definitely use that tool. Absolutely.
Cool. Yeah, one of the we there's we're sitting on all sorts of ideas on how to improve it and make it better, and we have I think it's a sign of a good product when, instead of kind of rushing in to do the next 10 things, you're just kind of sitting back and like seeing how people use it. And
Hmm.
I'm like eager to do a bunch of stuff to it, but at the same time it's working so well right now that I don't want to say we're like, I don't know, risk adverse to like change it, but we're just kind of trying to think about like what is the next way to make it better and better and better. And we know just simply growing the data set is something that will be helpful, but I think we've had some conversations around, hey, if you're looking at one artist, can we do an AI recommendation around, hey, here's 10 other artists that are similar,
Hmm.
pulling from Spotify recommendations, those types of things, or here's 10 other artists that are like, being booked in similar rooms. Make sure that
Yeah.
radar, like even pulling in roster data too. Again, like some of these things just, are just the same reason why it's been challenging to make Prism better and better and better over the years. Is just the kind of chopping wood and carrying water aspect of all of these things, and, resource constraint. But, yeah, it's just the beginning of all the things that we could do with insights. And
Yeah.
it was a chicken and egg problem that we had to crack, and without partners like you who were actively using Prism to settle all your shows and decided, hey, you know what, like let's get past some of the the competitive concerns that we have, and like let's look at the benefit, let's holistically look at the pros and the cons and decide to decide to do this because it all nets out in the right direction. So we appreciate you for jumping on it, and I'm very glad
Good.
it's been helpful for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like I have an interesting question for you. I mean, one of the
Please.
things that I run into that I can't believe is I'll run into people who are on Prism and then show hesitancy to settle their shows within Prism. And to me, my comment is like always like, well, that's the whole ball game. Like, why,
Yeah.
what are you doing? Do you guys run into that, or is that, and how do you work through that?
What's the source of the hesitancy? Is it not wanting to put their data in there, or is it like like the fear, like the change management in their process?
I think it's more like the change management.
Okay.
It's like we've got a guy who settles the shows. He likes to do it his way, you know?
Oh yeah. I mean, that's our biggest competitor by far. It's not even close.
Yeah.
When we go into venues, we're not like, oh, we're trying out this or that or the other thing, or we have a home bake system. It's spreadsheets and status quo and the old
Right.
things. And it's interesting even when people adopt Prism to a certain level, but then they don't take it the full direction. And I think you're right. Like when you do, a lot of our resources have gone into making settlement, you know, to better. And I think it's just classic change management, and
Yeah.
people know it's a complex process. And I have this. I did this quick case study with Matt Rusins from the Auditorium Theater,
Sure.
in your area, or well, Chicago. So,
Yeah.
but he put it more perfectly than anyone I've ever seen. I'll send you the clip afterwards. But he was
Hmm.
just like, I get it. I've been in it for 20 years. This industry is so crazy that you develop this way of doing things, and you finally figure it out, and you've put so much into doing it one way, and then something new comes along and you're just like, nah, like not gonna,
Right.
like I like there's so much pain, I think, in like the only people that it's a little bit of a paradox, I think. Like the only people that have made it have had to adopt like really, like it's filtered out a lot of people that just wouldn't put up with the bullshit. So they found some sort of system to make it work. And then there's hesitance to let go. But I think it's psychology, Matt, to answer your question. And I think it's also why, like, it's hard to replicate Prism, and it was hard for us to build it in the first place. Is like we had to cover a lot of nuances and make it user friendly. And even now, 7 years in, and there's been people that have seen the progression through the whole time. They're that hesitant to join, and I think it's not because of anything that we're doing wrong. I think it's that we just took on a really crazy problem, and a problem that people have learned specific behaviors on how to solve. So we're just kind of, our job is just to be patient keep making it better and better and better and better and better. And there's still things, there's still a list of things, as you know, there's still a giant list of things we can do to kind of keep completing the solution, and we'll keep doing it. Uh,
Sure.
it's funny now that all these like AI tools are coming out, and we're thinking through ways that we can that you could just like talk to Prism and have it do things for you. And I don't know if we have some prototypes. I don't know if anything's going to come soon. Uh,
Yeah,
but does that my answer make sense to you, Matt? And yeah,
it does. Yeah, it
yeah,
does. It does. I think the AI thing is really fascinating. Um, you know, because that's going to be. I mean, from a database standpoint, boy, there does seem to be a lot of there seems to be a lot of possibilities there.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
if I yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
go ahead.
Oh, I mean, again, I guess it probably comes into um, there's probably some privacy pieces to be considered here, but when you think about like,
No
okay,
doubt.
I have a 450 cap club or a 4,000 capacity theater or one thing or another. Um, look within the system, there's unquestionably um, trends that can easily be, that you would never be able to identify just as a single individual. Um, both I think across a broader network and even within your own system. It, you know,
Yeah, there's really big conversations happening right now, and some visions of grandiose, and like some true, really valuable things, and some speculative things. And
yeah.
it's honestly been very disorienting from a
Mm,
tech perspective, because it's kind of like the prophecies are wild that are being thrown out there right now about,
sure.
and I think there's my best guess is there's a beautiful merger in between, the
Mhm,
like systems like Salesforce.com or Prism, like, kind of using AI as a way to make the tool better and better and better. And like, yeah, to use natural language to interact with the app. I certainly don't think any venues are in the short term are going to just run their business on ChatGPT. Like, we're not necessarily like worried about that. Though, there's certainly been the people that have said, have thrown out that idea, and it's like, okay, like
mm.
maybe in 30 years from now, but for the time being, I think there's a lot of good purpose that a software application plays. But
It is funny. I heard this thing this morning
please, yeah,
on NPR where they were talking about this technologist who predicted that eventually, medical imaging, eventually AI, his big prediction was AI would remove humans from the process of medical imaging. And they fast forwarded to, today where it's like you've got like the Mayo Clinic and um, AI has been the biggest, development in terms of use as a tool for the
mhm,
imaging. But the fact is that, when it comes down to it, at least in that practice, it's the opposite of a replacement for a person. It is
yeah,
saying, okay, now suddenly we've gotten so much better at medical imaging because of this tool. We're expanding what we're doing. We're expanding the number of people working in this area because
ooh,
le-
bingo, yeah,
it's leading to great outcomes.
yeah,
And I think that, at some level, I mean, it's funny because you guys, um, I remember kind of an early kind of tagline for Prism was book more shows, right?
yeah, yeah,
And it's like, okay, it only works if they're quality, right? But the reality of it is that the better, I mean, this is what, I think part of the conversation we're having is um, the better we are at understanding our data, the better we are at understanding what the potential outcomes are, um, you know, the more likely we're going to get a quality result. And so therefore, as those results become on average more reliable, we can pivot from, every single show that we book needs to be this individual, carefully studied thing over to more of a volume based approach. We have our system, we know it works, we trust the tenants of the system as things come in, and we're pushing out more and more volume, and our business is getting more successful and expanding.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. Yeah. I mean, I think that's my optimistic future. And that's a beautiful example about imaging and just being able to do more. And that's my optimistic outlook with AI into the future is that, look, even in a world where there's 100-fold increase in productivity,
Mhm.
um, I think that this industry could use it just to manage what they're currently doing,
Right.
limited staff that they have. I've always felt that this was an industry where, and I think it's on the list of the most stressful industries on the planet next to like warfare. Like,
Yeah.
which is hilarious. It's like there's going to war, number one stressful thing, and then there's planning concerts, number
Yeah.
two.
Although, like, I think if the pandemic taught us anything about our industry, is that what we do is kind of silly at the end of the day, in a good way. But
Oh yeah, look, that's just the study is how right.
yeah, yeah,
No, and I think at the root of that is my observation is seeing like this industry is wildly productive.
mhm,
The amount of output small teams are able to do. Uh,
yeah,
and then, a tool like Prism, kind of helps these productive teams get even more. And then if Prism, there's all these things I want to do with Prism, and if AI unlocks that, then great. And then it unlocks you, and then maybe discovery really is kind of a better thing. You're not just waiting on the promoter to or sorry, agents to go on tour and email you, then you have this sea of ideas on how you could book the venue and develop more programming and get really, do all these things that are like what opens up when a lot of the tedious kind of stuff goes out of the way because your job is like part creativity, part logistics, tedious task.
right.
I think and maybe it's like 10% creativity, 90% task, and like what's the world that opens up when it flips, right? And like and with AI and Prism and all these things where you could be 99% in a creative.
Yeah, it's the old work smarter, not harder kind
Yeah.
of thing. The more that, I mean, I think that anybody that has worked hard enough to get a meaningful seat at the table in this industry is by their very nature a pretty hard worker and is going to be dedicated to the task. As much as I'd love to say, okay, everything I've got, I've never ended a workday going, everything is done. Right.
Yeah.
I don't think any of
Yeah.
us. And so that's
When are you gonna
it's
close the computer and not get to
right.
yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You get long enough into it and you go, okay, it's not that you got everything done. It's that, it was time to stop. And so I don't think anybody that's worked, hard enough in a competitive industry to get a meaningful seat at the table is just suddenly going to go, okay, now I'm just good. My work is done. It's cool. I'm out of here. It's more like, okay, now you can focus your attention to, uh, more effective tasks. Right. And, in our world, it becomes a conversation about do we now have more attention to how do I either maximize what I've got sitting on my roster, um, or how do I go pursue more, right? And how do I improve the quality of that product? And those are questions that if you're buried in a spreadsheet trying to figure out why the thing won't balance, that feels like work. It is work, but if it's not necessary work, then there's, there's no reason to say, okay, this is the reason my day extended out to 12 hours or something
Yeah.
like because I was buried in settlements or I was dealing with a tedious offer process or something like that. Um, so I think just by kind of the sheer osmosis of it all, um, we find ourselves doing more meaningful work if we're able to bypass some of these previously manual processes.
Yeah.
I would love to say, okay, I'm going to be, um, surfing through volumes and volumes of, uh, box office data or one thing or another. And if we go, okay, there's a much faster way to access this, be it through AI or be it through just, this being consolidated onto a single system or easier to access, take that all day long.
Yep. Yep. I'm into that. Yeah, I think, one kind of simple thing would be, you or Gary are on a walk, or you're in the airport or something, and you just, you have your earbud in and you're just talking to Prism, and
Uh,
like hey, give me the update. And it's like, okay, last week you booked 10 shows, and this and this happened, and and Amber, whatever, booked the most amount of shows,
yeah,
and here's the profit trend. And then Gary kind of responds back, they're like, okay, like what's working at the venue in the last month, like what's not working. And and AI is giving you really quick, like, we're not so far away from being able to implement that. And I think, like, that's like one thing that could be really interesting. Like, there's and then and then you have the interface where you can go in, you can run your own reports, you can like look at the data. And I think I want to see a world where humans are doing both. Like, they're Spark Note, they're using AI for Spark Notes or even deep dives, but then they're saying, "Are you know what? Like, I also want to go into Prism and set up my own dashboards." And I think, some people are like,
right.
"Do the dashboards go away?" And I'm like, I don't think we want to get to a place as a society where humans aren't also kind of thinking about how they want to view data, the patterns that they're seeing. But AI can be, back to the imaging thing, like the AI can just tell you the raw data quite quickly, and its compute power, maybe that helps you then go and say, oh, maybe I should be looking at it differently. So anyway, I kind of believe in a coexist.
Yeah,
I don't want to see humans shut off their brain, but
yeah,
I would be foolhardy to not also think about, like, how can Prism, do these things,
yeah. There's
that
really simple things. There's really simple things. If
that be
create an
appealing.
you create an offer. I mean, to me, it's just a simple thing. You create an offer, and you assign a certain agent or agency to it. Populating a dashboard of going, okay, here are the last 10 outcomes, or here's the consolidated outcome, or whatever. And then we start to understand, what is inherently an intuitive business, right? Um, Starts to be more data driven, starts to be, you know, less about just like, okay, these are the relationships. I really trust this person and they're throwing a good sale out. It doesn't mean you don't override that from time to time, but
Totally.
it also understanding the data and going like, okay, here's an agent who's pushing and pushing and pushing. And how confident am I that I should push back? How
Yeah.
confident that I should, you know, I try not to tell anybody to lose my number or anything like that. But there's also an aspect of, okay, they're asking to fill a Thursday night in the middle of July with a, a classic rock band, and we can look and go, okay, you know, what is this? What do we know about this agent? What do we know about this artist? What do we know about this time period? What do we know about shows in this genre? All those sorts of things are things that
Other
feed
events in the
into it.
market,
Yeah. Yeah, so there's definitely like
other patterns.
there's a much deeper dive that can be had. And then by the way, Prism has the ability to come back around and premise check that. If I'm giving this um giving this offer or this show an A rating because of a confluence of factors, you, you know, um that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a win. But again, we're, you know, doing what we do is definitely a game of inches. And so any leg up
Mm,
is a benefit.
mm. I love that. I love that. Well, you got another 5 or so? Just,
Yeah, I think about another five is good. Yeah.
okay, cool. I should probably run too. Well, one thing that I think would just be fun to get your perspective on,
Hmm.
allegedly May 12th, it are we on May 12th? Oh
May
gosh.
14th today.
Yeah, allegedly it's now illegal for ticketing companies to not list on pricing. Have you followed this?
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask you about this. I was going to ask you about this.
I was gonna ask you about it. Yeah.
I think that is, I think it's a strong consideration for prison because suddenly um, we're in a place where I think we always, as a promoter, should have been asking ourselves the question, you know, what does the final cart look like to the customer?
Yeah.
Um, Now that has gone from like, okay, you know, you really here's this piece of your business that you probably don't give enough time to. Well, now it's being jammed squarely in our faces. And so if you were to say, well, what would a priority development be for Prism? I would think calculating final cart to customer per ticket would
Mm.
be pretty important.
Yeah.
I would think that would be pretty important. And it's going to ask a lot of different factors. It's going to say, okay, we need to then take some new inputs here because we need to take inputs on what is the ticket service fee online? What are the, sales tax? Is this sales tax built into the ticket or is it on top of the ticket? All those sorts of things that weren't necessarily, um, y- you know, are natural inputs to the system. But if I were in any kind of development piece here, I think that's going to be a big topic coming
Yep.
up.
And again, I think there's something that we can do purpose built, but inside of Prism, you can just kind of you can just start with that final cart price and then back it out. And I think Matt, you bring up a very there's if you
But
can just
there's what needs to go in the offer, and then there's what's on the data side that I can see, and those are a little bit different.
no, and it's a really interesting conversation about how can Prism step into that, and we for sure will. I think you bring up a fascinating point that the end cart to the customer is now front and center, and I think the whole model of the ticket industry has been really fascinating, and it's been predicated on this idea that to a certain extent, the fee that you pass along to a customer at the end of a checkout is a bit of a horn of plenty. And so as long as it doesn't double the gross ticket price, it's not lost revenue to you. It's just something that it's the way the ticketing company makes money. And they end up, you and I have talked about this before. They end up getting, let's call a small club that does 50,000 tickets a year. They might end up making $200,000 off of that club in a year, which like for Prism to charge for that would be like outrageous. Like, maybe we only charge a club $8,000 a year, but because of the genius of that model of, oh, hey, there's a certain amount of the ticket fee that we can get away with. Now, I wonder if it's going to change the psychology of fees and, there's downstream implications of this change. It seems like a small change, but it's
Oh,
disruptive.
I think it's going to put. I think that I kind of think of it in two different directions. Um, this thing with ticket service fees really comes down to, there's almost like an original sin
Yeah.
that, took place 30, 40 years ago that we're now all just kind of recovering from. It's sort of the same as like, okay, we now have these gas guzzling vehicles that it turns out are, y- you know, changing our climate to the degree that it may represent an extinction level event. But
And on top of
our
that, it turns out gas isn't, that we can run out of it at some point too,
right,
even
but
if it doesn't kill the planet. Yeah.
just turning around and saying, okay, this is not good, but everybody needs to give up their car right this minute.
Yeah.
Well, that's not happening.
Yep.
And, you know, I'm afraid to say with ticketing, it's the same sort of thing. It's like, okay, we can pivot in this direction, or we can pivot in that direction, whatever. But there's, I think in many ways, level setting is definitely a good thing to say, okay, this needs to be more clear to the consumer. And this is something that, I think without question will cause, um, hopefully, an overall reduction in the cost to the consumer, which I think is really important.
Yep.
Um, but I also think that it's kind of tough because it's like, okay, you look at, um, the speed at which something like Ticketmaster is able to pivot to this, and they've got their, we're all in, messaging and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, but aren't you guys kind of the ones that started all this? Like, isn't that where this came from? And
For
so,
sure.
and so I think when you talk about independence, you talk about independent ticketing companies, you talk about, I mean, when you talk to, when you saw the testimony for Congress and they were speaking to the gentleman from the band Lawrence, and they asked him, what do you think about all in ticketing? Suddenly he's sitting in a system where there's a basic understanding, at least in his mind, that the consumer interprets the portion that's going to the artist to be the face value, and then these ticket service fees to be some stew of everybody else in the process.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so from the standpoint of he's in touch with, because that's the issue. Like overall, the issue of ticket service fees is that it's hard for everybody within the process to come to terms with the fact that this is not cheap stuff to produce, right?
Absolutely.
And if we
Absolutely.
want to produce a certain kind of show, if we want to do it at a place where um, the people that are taking risk aren't at such an inverse level of risk that they're not going to want to do it anymore. This is one pathway to it. The bad part is it's really not great for the consumer.
Yep.
But unraveling it, with a single step like this, I don't think it's quite that simple. Um, I think that the part we're not even talking about is the secondary market as it
Absolutely.
relates there. And, in terms of the arms race of ticket prices and all that sort of thing, um, frankly, ticket service fees, I mean, it's like comparing, Revolutionary War muskets to like an F-16 when you're talking about ticket service fees and the secondary
Yeah.
market. These are two, just insanely different things.
And then even in the secondary, there's different aspects of it too, which is like
How the fees impart. Oh my God.
if you're
Yeah.
just transferring a ticket to a friend, it's like not nefarious and probably a good service, for the world. But then it turns into the bots and the spec tickets and like it's
Oh, God help
all
you.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. Trust me. Yeah. We're all just sitting around hoping that, people don't get too fast to monetize every single step that the consumer makes. It's like, well, can some of this just be about making the product more user friendly for people? But that's not, unfortunately, that's not always the business we're in.
Well, let's end with this. Just a quick kind of yes or no,
Sure.
if possible. This is not solving secondary. There's complications with doing this.
Right.
If you part all the hairs, is this a good step forward?
I think it is. I think it is.
Cool.
I think it is. I think it's, um, but I also think it's complicated.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we'll see. We'll see. I mean, look, if we are all sitting here next week and we go, okay, we just made this change and our ticket sales fell off the cliff because the consumer has been trained that the next screen will have a shitload of fees on it, and then they don't, you know, and
Yeah.
have we reached that? Then I'll eat my words because that means that a bunch of people go out of business and we're all going to lose jobs and that kind of stuff. I don't think that's what's going to happen. You know,
Right. And it may not take
uh,
a week. It may have to be a conversation in a couple years from now, 3 years from now, and just all the ways that things are going to change.
yeah. Look, it should go hand in hand though with other reforms within the industry that makes this not a great place for consumers. I mean, at the end of the day, our goal should have this to be a consumer friendly
Yeah.
experience. I mean, what we're ultimately at shows, we're, you know, celebrating, joy and fandom and all those sorts of things. Uh, you know, I I think we as an industry have spent way too much time um taking advantage of the attractiveness of our product. And I think But it's not as simple as one player in the game,
Yeah,
and it's not as simple as one piece of government legislation.
I'm into that. I'm into
Yeah.
that. Well, Matt, it's always a pleasure talking with you. This was
Yeah, same.
extremely helpful. So thank you. I'll
Good.
get it chopped up and sent out before Neva.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right. Thanks, man.
All right. Well, I'll see you in Milwaukee soon. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see you soon. Take care.
All right. Bye.
Bye.